Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Fascism and Empire by Rajani Palme Dutt from 1935. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So we recently recorded the very long, over 13 hours, Fascism and Social Revolution from the same year, 1935, by the same author, Rajani Palme Dutt. Excellent book. Really wish I had read it years earlier, and really one of my favorites of all time. YouTube has a 12-hour limit for videos, and like I said, it is 13 hours, so I had to break it up into two parts, but I do have part 1 of 2 pinned as the featured video for returning subscribers on the YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. I think it's crucial, particularly if you're living in one of the advanced countries, because fascism isn't just a violent government. It is a particular phenomenon arising in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism or advanced monopoly capitalism, and it's important to understand its nature, its purpose, its class basis, because it will try to deceive you. It'll try to take you in with some sort of appeals to workers, and they usually try to sneak some kind of socialist dressing in there. But fascism really does not offer a future. It is the organized essence of social decay and the consequence of failing to carry out the proletarian revolution after it becomes possible to do so. At this point, capitalism can progress no further. It can offer no more historic progress to humanity, and the only way to continue social progress is through the social revolution. So great book, a lot of answers in that book, great anti-fascism, and also a good introduction to Marxist-Leninist topics. So on that note, let's get into this reading, which is a much shorter read. It's only a 6-page PDF instead of a 300-plus page PDF. And again, if you like this one, read Fascism and Social Revolution. All right, let's get into it. Fascism is revealed today as the more and more dominant policy of capitalism in crisis all over the world. Fascism means the rule of the most violent, chauvinist elements of imperialism, throwing aside all democratic pretenses and using every device of terrorist dictatorship to smash the revolt of the working class and of the colonial peoples. In its initial development, fascism appears as a phenomenon above all of the big imperialist countries, arising in the metropolitan centers of finance capital to crush the rising working class movement which threatens its power. In order to achieve this task, fascism has to resort to demagogy so as to delude the petty bourgeois masses and backward strata of the workers into doing its work. For this purpose, fascism puts on a, quote, national mask. Britain first, Germany first, Italy first is the slogan of fascism. National self-sufficiency, autarky, economic isolation of each nation within its own barriers is declared to be the only path to solve the economic crisis. Comment, remember here that this was just a few years after the crash of 1929 and the start of the Great Depression. Continuing. But this national cover is only a lie to deceive the innocent. Fascism is in reality the weapon and policy of monopoly capital, that is, of imperialism, of the Thyssens and Krupps, of the Daterdings and Rothermeres, of the Mons and the Fords, of the Wall Street and the City and the German Steel Trust and the Comité des Forges. Monopoly capital cannot find scope for the gigantic modern forces of production within the national frontiers. This is only a fantasy of propaganda. It must constantly seek to extend its rule. It organizes the intensified dictatorship of the big trusts within each national unit only in order to fight more effectively on the world scale, for the world market, for world domination, for new spheres of influence, to extend the monopolist area of exploitation throughout the world, or the conquest of new spoils. Fascism is thus the weapon not of national self-sufficiency as it pretends, but of world power, of extended and intensified colonial domination and exploitation. Aggression and expansion. More territory, new spheres of world influence. This is the real war cry of fascism. The future of Italy, proclaims Mussolini, lies in Asia and Africa. Italy must extend its rule over the Near East and Northern Africa. Germany, cry the Nazis, must win back its lost colonies, and must also win new subject territory in Eastern Europe. Quote, today, Germany, complains Hitler in his Mein Kampf, is not a world power. From a purely territorial point of view, the area of the German Reich is insignificant compared with those of the so-called world powers, unquote, i.e. the British Empire, French Empire, American Empire, etc. Quote, "The National Socialist movement must attempt to remove the disproportion between our population and our area," unquote. The Japanese militarist fascist dictatorship of Araki and his colleagues, who proclaim their admiration of German National Socialism as their model, combines terrorist methods at home with unlimited aggression and expansion policies through the Far East. British fascism, voiced by the Rothermeres and Mosleys and in another form by the Churchills, Lloyds, and Beaverbrookes, calls for the, quote, "strong hand" to maintain colonial domination, away with the, quote, "weakness" of Baldwin and MacDonald, away with concessions and constitutional pretenses. Ruthless repression is their watchword. The colonial rule of the finance capitalist oligarchies, centered in Europe, the United States, and Japan, is tottering. The colonial peoples are rising in ever-renewed and stronger waves of assault to win their freedom. Therefore, the policy of imperialism turns to ever more repressive measures. Absolutism. In the first stage after the war, World War I, the attempt was made to meet the rising revolt of the colonial peoples, not only with bloody repression, but at the same time with a liberal show of concessions, with lying promises of self-government in the vague future, with democratic talk and caricatures of constitutions. All this humbug, however, failed to stem the revolt, failed to win more than a section of the national bourgeoisie in each country. The oppressed and hungering masses who could not live on a diet of formulas and white papers, or as we would say today, platitudes, went forward with their struggle against the unchanged dictatorship. Today, all this liberal talk is more and more thrown on one side. The previous promises are denied or interpreted away. The policy moves steadily to the right. The latest constitutional reforms under discussion for India drop the last shreds of, quote, democratic pretenses, proclaim openly the absolutism of the viceroy and the governors in every sphere, and seek to draw in the most reactionary feudal forces, the ruling princes, to buttress the whole structure. The British Empire, in its present stage of extreme decay, affords the most instructive study of the increasing tendency toward fascism as the final policy of the ruling white bourgeoisie. The Ottawa Conference represented the attempt of the British bourgeoisie and of the subordinate semi-independent bourgeoisies in the Dominions to overcome the growing disintegration and draw closer the bonds by a series of economic measures. But the Ottawa measures have failed to produce any important result. Between 1931 and 1933, British exports to the Empire have fallen by £7 million, while British imports from the Empire have risen by £2 million. Between 1932, the year of Ottawa, and 1933, British exports to the Empire fell by £2 million, at the same time as British exports to non-Empire countries rose by £4.5 million, while British imports from the Empire rose by £1.3 million. These changes are in any case minute and are solely at the expense of Britain. The Dominions bourgeoisies have taken advantage of Britain's wooing to increase their hold on the British market, while their nominal concessions in exchange have only resulted in falling British exports to their market. Ottawa, in short, has only meant that Britain has paid blackmail to keep some hold on the disintegrating dominions, but has reached no solution of the economic problem or the problem of disintegration. Stronger measures required to be adopted if the weakening British hold is to be maintained. And here fascism comes to the front, not only within Britain, but in the attempt to stimulate subordinate fascist movements in the Dominions. Fascist movements. The fight against Ireland is maintained on the lines of economic war, and at the same time the Blue Shirt movement is developed under General O'Duffy and Cosgrave with British encouragement and support to prepare the fighting force for the subjugation of Ireland, quote, with the maximum economy of British lives, unquote. Newfoundland is transformed at a stroke from a dominion into a subject colony under the dictatorship of a British governing commission. In Australia, the New Guard is organized under Colonel Eric Campbell to conduct the fight against the working class and maintain the control of the combined British and Australian capitalist class. A similar New Guard has also been organized in New Zealand and in South Africa. These movements are all organized together in the New Empire Union. In South Africa, the formerly opposed British and Dutch bourgeois parties, the South Africa Party of Smuts, and the Nationalist Party of Hertzog, draw together in ever closer coalition against the enslaved African 5/6 majority of the population of the South African Union. At the same time, pressure on India and the Crown colonies is increased. Not only does the British government policy on India, as indicated, move steadily to the right, but the demand of right-wing conservatism becomes ever more clamorous for the dropping of all constitutional shams and pretenses and an unlimited policy of the iron heel in India. This becomes the test issue of diehardism in Britain in the present period, and its vote in the National Conference of Conservative Associations rises from below 1/3 in 1933 to over 2/5 at the conference held in March 1934. Quote, India must remain within the empire. Every attempt at liberation must be, quote, ruthlessly suppressed, writes Mosley in Greater Britain. All the national pretenses of fascism here disappear from view. Quote, the Indian market, writes the black shirt, is, quote, vital to Britain. Quote, this is the fundamental economic reason why British rule in India must be maintained, unquote. The Lancashire textile manufacturers, viewing their weakening hold in India, moved to the support of fascism. One of their leading representatives writes in the Oldham Chronicle, quote, is there any wonder that the youth of this country, tired of procrastination, sick at heart, and with no hope of improvement or employment, are turning in ever-increasing numbers to the more virile policy of Sir Oswald Mosley and the creed of Britain First, unquote. Fascism represents the supreme violent attempt to maintain a hold by every means of terrorism against both the working class in the imperialist countries and the exploited masses in the colonial countries. The struggle is being drawn together more closely than ever before. The privileged condition of the working masses in the imperialist countries is passing away. The conditions of the struggle against ever more violent and lawless terrorism, which can only be overthrown in revolutionary battle, are approximating closer throughout the world. Therefore, the unity of the struggle grows. The united struggle will defeat the last furies of dying capitalism, will overthrow both fascism and colonial domination. In the development of this combined struggle, the League Against Imperialism has a large and increasing role to play and confidently calls for the support of all working class organizations and of all national revolutionary anti-imperialist movements. We are approaching the most critical stage of a world struggle for liberation against enslavement, war, and destruction. All right, that's the end of the audiobook. So about that last part, World War II did change things significantly. Following that, there was a shift away from the classical model of colonialism toward a relatively more flexible system whereby the imperialist powers could share in the exploitation of the underdeveloped countries without there being such a particular claim of this imperialist rules that country as its own particular property. Of course, some of that still persisted, but they did figure out some ways to make the overall system somewhat less rigid, thus buying themselves some amount of time until the next inter-imperialist war. Also, the bit about the struggle being drawn together more closely than before between the working masses in the imperialist countries and the exploited masses in the colonial countries. This was true, and definitely those struggles need to be linked. However, World War II resulted in a lot of destruction of capital, and countries like the US saw the establishment of a permanent war economy, and these were factors in getting out of the crisis of capitalism, at least for the time being, that was brought in 1929. So with the imperialists having gained a little bit of breathing room, they did resume efforts to buy off the proletariat in the imperialist countries, using the super profits brought in through the world imperialist system. However, particularly after the profitability crisis of the 60s and 70s, the capitalist class pivoted more and more to the neoliberal, anti-social democratic rollback. So today, even a very poor person in the United States is going to have more access to resources and somewhat more opportunities than a very poor person in many other countries of the world, because nothing in capitalism is even. I think you could argue that today, again, that amount of privilege for living in an imperialist country is shrinking somewhat. And lastly, a comment on Dutt's closing note about the call for the support of all working class organizations and all national revolutionary anti-imperialist movements. It's important to remember that at this time, 1935, the Comintern still existed, was intact, and the USSR still existed and was blazing a trail toward communism, building socialism over 1/6 of the world, and was providing guidance and resources for proletarian organizations and parties to be at the head of national liberation movements. There is unfortunately in 2024 a tendency for all kinds of nationalism to be proclaimed under the banner of so-called anti-imperialism, but which has no basis in Marxism whatsoever and which really does not include the idea of a transition, a quick transition, from a national bourgeois revolution to a proletarian socialist one. This is one of the deceptions of fascism itself, that by going up against the established imperialist powers, it is somehow anti-imperialist, when actually it's just another group of advanced monopoly capitalists trying to get themselves a bigger cut of the profits and a bigger seat at the table. If you find this confusing, don't worry. It's actually meant to be confusing by the people who are putting it out. And the reason for that is that their material interests are diametrically opposed to yours. What's good for you is bad for them, and what's good for them is bad for you. So naturally, they can't tell you the truth. This is why we study Marxism-Leninism, and you do have to study. You can't just wing it. It's so that we can maintain an independent proletarian class perspective and not get bound up and swept away in the tide of bourgeois propaganda about what our tasks are and what our priorities should be. All right, we're going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion in the comments section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every contribution is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. I would make some kind of content even if no one supported, but the continued support allows me to spend a lot more time on this than I'd be able to do otherwise, which is especially important since this is a non-commercial viewer-supported channel. Beyond that, engagement counts, so please like, share, subscribe, and get involved with your local left. Take what you've learned here into the real world. Help to organize toward success in the class struggle in your area. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.